Good morning, everybody. I think we're ready to go. It's just past 10:45, so welcome. Thank you for joining the program today, this important conference on perspectives about identity. Okay, so I'm Eric Anderson, and again, thank you for coming to this breakout session. I wanted to focus my talk about identity on American Indians, and particularly the history of boarding schools that were established for Native American youth, principally in the 19th century, but then continued on well into the 20th. So I'm from Haskell Indian Nations University. I'm citizen Potawatomi by birth or by privilege. I've been at Haskell about 16 years. How many of you are at least somewhat familiar with Haskell? You've heard of it at least, good. Haskell is a school that was one of these places that was originally set up as a boarding institution where the focus was assimilation and destruction of traditional indigenous identity. So I want to look at some of the history of Haskell, but broaden it out a little bit to boarding schools in general. And just so you know, I have to leave a little bit early to drive to give this presentation again, about an hour and 10 minutes away from here. But I think we'll have plenty of time to go through the slides and to address any questions or comments that you might have. You'll notice that the title of the talk is A Brief History of Boarding Schools, and focusing largely on about a 50-year period, beginning with the model for the federal boarding schools and taking it up to kind of around the time where that was beginning to change. So it's a brief history because this is a big topic. It's a complicated topic. We could have a whole conference just on boarding schools. So my talk will be something of a thumbnail sketch, and because I have to leave a few minutes earlier, it's maybe even briefer than usual. But I think you will get a picture, a pretty well-rounded picture, I hope, of what these places were, what their aims were, and what they tried to do, and maybe what they did not accomplish as well. So boarding schools. I think that when we hear those words, the association might tend to take us to someplace in Switzerland or the East Coast, these nice kind of elite places where you send your kids off to get this very quality education. And those are not the kind of boarding schools I'm talking about here, okay? These boarding schools, although in the minds of those who created them were termed elite, were places of very limited academic education, at least at first and through much of the period that I'm going to talk about. How many of you know at least something about these schools? That's great. When I started doing public history on this topic, probably 25 or so years ago, very few people knew about this history outside of Indian country. Within American Indian and Alaska Native communities, this is a topic that's very familiar. And I'm glad to know that over time, others have begun to hear about, learn more about this period in our national history. So I have just recently revised this program. You're the first ones to see it in this iteration. I will really try to stay focused on what the slides are intended to convey. But because this is my area of expertise, it's really easy for me to go off into tangents, and I'll try not to do that because our time is limited anyway. But I also want to leave a lot of time for questions, because generally there are quite a few. But I'm glad to know you have some acquaintance with the topic. So let's go ahead and begin. Great, clicker works. The idea of boarding institutions for the native people of the North American continent doesn't come out of nowhere. We tend to think about, and my program will largely focus on, what was happening beginning in the post-Civil War period. But the idea of transforming Indians is very old. Europeans who came to this continent brought with them a principal design of trying to change indigenous people right from the beginning. When Columbus came, although he didn't actually set foot on the North American continent itself, he brought priests with him. And the idea was that they would spread the faith of Christianity, Catholicism specifically, among the people who they considered to be heathens, people who they considered to be pagans outside of the light of Christianity. So they had in mind, not just looking for resources and wealth and territorial expansion, but also ideological expansion through the means of missionizing. And so I would be remiss if I didn't give you that foundation to think about. So missionaries very early on set up schools or places of training that were centered upon that transformation in terms of religious conversion. And they began that process very early, and that eventually came to inhabit specific places. Sometimes in the early days, missionaries would go directly to where the Indians were. With time, it became a matter of trying to draw in American Indians and later Alaska Natives into places that were specifically designed for their transformation. When we think about the history of boarding schools, I think the current count is somewhere around 500 schools. So that means there's a lot of this business of transformation going on in a number of different ways, whether it's centered specifically in conversion to Christianity or something a little more secular, but that still had that idea of transformation embedded in it. When we think about the Spanish and the French, for instance, and the Russians in Alaska, their colonies were pretty small in terms of the number of people who were there. But they had that mission of conversion at their core, along with the other things they were interested in. But with the English, which becomes then the model for the United States, those 13 British colonies being the ones who broke away from Mother England. One of the first things that some of those colonists did when they got here, particularly thinking about the place they called New England, is to establish centers of learning in the form of colleges and universities. And very early in the history of those schools, these places developed programs to train young Indians. So the history of Harvard, Dartmouth, College of William and Mary, and others have right there baked in this principle of transforming Indians. And of course, those schools in the early days were largely concerned with training in the tradition of the Christian religion. After the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War and the establishment of the United States, in the early national period, that tradition continues. And so that's why I mentioned the Congressional 1819 Act called the Civilization Act, wherein monies were set aside to specifically train Native people in the values of Western culture. And a lot of that money was given over to missionaries. So what started in the colonial period then carries over into the national period. And just to give you some background, I'm sorry, I'm moving around and I hope that's not distracting, but I kind of want to see what's up there, make sure I'm on the right slide. If you went into an archive, library, if you were doing some research on Native and colonial relationships, you would very quickly, I think, run across a term that was bandied about a lot. And it comes from this perspective of the colonizers. They thought of the presence of Native Americans as a problem to be solved in one way or another. Talked about an Indian problem that the United States had. And that guided policy throughout the 19th century and carried over then into the 20th century as well. I always ask my students, and I teach in an all-Native institution, what was the problem? What was this ethnocentrically posed problem that the newcomers perceived? The problem was that Indians existed. Indians existed on land that those colonists and later the United States had their eyes on. That means they sat upon resources that were also coveted. And the existence of traditional life was a problem, because how are you going to divorce the people of the land, from those geographical places where they were? And that took place in lots of different ways. For a good part of the 19th century in the history of the United States, that meant things like warfare, eradication of the Indian presence. I think the determination was probably realized, I can't say a certain day, but at some point you're not going to be able to get rid of everybody. So there were other tactics that would include dispossession of land through means like treaties. Treaties, which began with the United States very early on in its history and continued into the early 1870s. 99.9% of them are focused on land, trading one piece of land for another. They also use tactics like removal and relocation. I think everybody's heard of the story of southeastern tribes being removed to what's now Oklahoma on so-called Trail of Tears. That was a legal process. There are other processes we could consider de facto, extra legal, but they weren't sanctioned. So in cases of epidemics of disease or just the rush of new people coming into the areas where Indians were, that kind of compelled them to move out of those areas. And so removal is not just a legal process, but relocation happens through other mechanisms as well. So warfare, if we lump all that kind of into one group, is one tactic. There are also reform measures that are trying to do something that isn't focused necessarily on conflict and violence, but still carried with it maybe the spirit of what those warfare tactics did, and also carried with it those older colonial efforts to change Indians. So I'm kind of lumping these two things into warfare and reform. And I think getting to the idea of the federal system of boarding schools for American Indians and Alaska Natives that's happening by the 1870s, we could very much put into that larger terminology of reform. By the 1870s, treaties have ended and most Indians are on reservations. So they've either been removed or they've been concentrated into certain places so that they're no longer able, in most cases, to kind of freely come and go from the lands that are now considered theirs. And those borders will shift in many cases quite radically even after the territorial limits of reservations have been established. After the Civil War, I think we can certainly point to an attitude among American people that conflict and war is something that they've grown tired of. 600,000 Americans, more than that, died in the Civil War. So by the 1870s, with at least one aspect of the Indian problem having been, for the most part, addressed, which is the creation of concentrated places where natives are located, I think that and the distaste for widespread death kind of coalesce into a broader reform effort, which manifested itself in terms of an educational policy. And I want to pause for 1 minute and thinking about that word education. When we say education in this context, I would ask you to consider the term might be better phrased as re-education. Because if we just say what's happening is education of Indians, it presupposes that they didn't have ways of educating themselves. And of course they did. They had a whole body of tradition that went into educating their young people. So think about that as we look at how some of these schools developed and what their main aims and guiding principles were. I mentioned Grant's peace policy there, and I'm not going to drill down too much into that, but President Grant, as you know, led the Union forces in the Civil War and then became president in the Reconstruction period. Because most Indians were on reservations, he sought to do something different. And again, that focused largely on handing over those re-education efforts to missionaries. Sometimes it's called the Quaker policy because Grant appointed a lot of Quakers and other denominational Christian groups or leaders to be reservation agents. The policy is not entirely well received by the general public, who I think by and large are hostile to any native presence, at least in their midst. And so Grant's presidency, which I think sometimes is poorly judged a failure in whole, was certainly by the general public deemed a failure, partly due to his Indian policy. And of course, if you think about it, it's also a failure in the sense that it's not a peaceful time. Right? The only time that the United States is defeated on the field of battle by native forces is during the Grant administration at the Greasy Grass, Little Bighorn, right? So there's a lot that could be said about that, but I just wanted to address that piece. And coming out of that, by the late 1870s, you have the establishment of the Carlisle School. Anybody heard of Carlisle before? A few of you. So Carlisle becomes very much the model for the federal system that emerges in its wake pretty quickly in its wake. Carlisle is not fully federally supported, but it definitely designs the recipe for the federal system that's going to emerge pretty quickly. And Richard Henry Pratt is pretty well known for this quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man," which sums up a lot of the thinking in the mind of these self-styled reformers who call themselves friends of the Indian. And it means essentially we're going to not kill the people, but we're going to kill the cultures. So they've got the word kill in it. I mean, so it's still kind of moving along that same trajectory of warfare, but save the person. And how is that going to happen? Well, I'll give you some indications in a moment. If you think about it, this could be just the obverse of that other credo you've heard, the only good Indian's a dead one, William Tecumseh Sherman, right? The idea is now not one of genocide, but ethnocide. And the war will now be prosecuted against Indian children. So just 5 years after Carlisle opens, Haskell Institute opens over in Lawrence. And it's very much guided by what happened beginning at Carlisle. It opens with a very small number of students, but it quickly grows. And by 1910 or so, it's the largest of the federal Indian schools, even surpassing Carlisle. This is a map that gives you some indication of the reach of these schools that the federal government establishes. And what it's showing you in those black dots with the numbers are the schools that the government invested in, that they thought of as the potentially most successful in putting forward this reform policy and this re-education policy. These are the so-called elite schools. These are the ones that are located away from reservation communities, because there are schools on the reservations that are being run or funded by the federal government. There are day schools where Indian children go during the day, just like public schools today, but then they come home to their parents, their families, their communities. People like Pratt are saying that is not going to work to achieve this killing of the Indian and saving of the man, because they're just going to go back to use kind of his terminology, like a hog to its wallow. They're just going to be ensconced in those traditions the rest of the time. So what good does it do to try and educate them for only part of the day? There are also boarding schools on or near reservations, but in the estimation of these reformers, that's not good enough either, because they will return to their communities on the weekends, for holidays. It's very easy for them to just leave and go back home because they're located nearby. So these schools are designed to be away from home. In some cases, very far away from home. Most Indians east of the Mississippi, by the time of this map's showing you, 1880 or so, have been removed. There aren't that many left. So sending people all the way out to Carlisle, or up to the old Northwest, that's a long ways from home. And even for students coming from Oklahoma, Haskell's pretty far away. And by the 1890s, Haskell's got students from as far away as California and Alaska. So that is a very far geographical distance. That's the idea. Get them away from home and keep them there. That's the only thing that's going to work. to put forward this assimilation agenda of reshaping their identity. So the map is not complete for federal schools, but it's showing you that system of the off-reservation boarding schools. So assimilation efforts, that's the key. Changing identity. Getting them away from home, keeping them there, and taking away everything that is traditional and familiar, right? And a lot of the schools, as you can see Haskell there on the left and the Chamala School on the right, have these archways, kind of like, okay, welcome to your new world. I was showing my students this film the other day called The Education of Little Tree. And the boy goes to an Indian school and there's a gate like this, and they say, beyond this, you don't speak English. You don't do anything that you learned at home. And so I think those archways are kind of symbolic of that thinking. I've been talking about Richard Henry Pratt. There's a picture of him. You can see he's a military guy. He's a very interesting character, to say the least. He has some interesting experiences that kind of lead him to his thinking about Native people. And I just to add a little more context, Pratt, because of his military training, brings a very militaristic kind of regimen to the schools. And that's implemented at those other schools that you saw on the map. He has experience with Indians. I would say, to his credit, his approach, although harsh, included the idea that these people are human beings. And that, I think, does make him genuinely a reformer. Although from the context of today, the things that he did, we perhaps would judge as very wrong-headed. Over there on the right is Dudley C. Haskell, for whom Haskell Institute and the current iteration, Haskell Indian Nations University, is named. My students are always surprised. Why are we named after some white guy? And Haskell was a rising star in politics. He was chair of the House Committee on Indian Affairs, being a good politician, and seeing the writing on the wall with these friends of the Indians who were influencing policy. He wanted to steer one of these schools to his home district. Right? Good pork belly project. Right? So the model for the schools is coming out of the Carlisle tradition, and it pretty much applies at least to those 25 or so schools that you saw on the map that are established by 1900. And that's a really rapid kind of implementation of a system for the federal government, if you think about it. 25 years or 20 odd years and 25 or so of these large institutions that are aimed at transforming thousands of Indian young people. I put a few bullet points here that I think give you a pretty good sense of what they were about. The self-styled Friends of the Indian saw absolutely no value in the cultures of Native people, and that should be eradicated. So that warfare idea of destruction is still implicit in the model. They are very culturally blinded. I sometimes think about they might have had more success on their own terms if they had tried to integrate some traditional thinking. But they weren't interested in that. They saw Native people in their customary ways as being savage, of course, with their own ideas about what civilization was. And that guided the thinking at the schools. Of course, the family separation dynamic that I mentioned, taking young children away from their homes and keeping them at remove for a long time. English is the #1 priority, destroying tribal languages. Um, maybe it's number two. Maybe number one is family separation, destroying ties to home. And then in these places, inculcating them in English, it still has the Christianity piece in there. These federal schools, I would say to a one, had chapels where students were compelled to go on Sundays, certainly. So when we think about separation of church and state, there wasn't much of that going on in schools. And then industry, what was deemed to be basically a Christian work ethic. And again, on the presumption that Indians weren't industrious, that they were producing nothing of value. So they need to be reshaped from the ground up. As I mentioned, the academic piece of this is really limited. The schedule for students is exceedingly highly structured. The focus is on fundamental change and also lasting change. Not just do these things while you're here at school, but go on and practice them for the rest of your lives. They're dangling out there sort of amorphously an idea about citizenship. But the schools on their own do not produce that. Blanket citizenship does not come to American Indians until 1924. So in the meantime, Indians are inhabiting this limbo status. They're on reservations established by the federal government, or they're in the schools. They're not citizens of the United States, and they're no longer considered to be independent nations. So they're wards of the United States government, which makes the job of putting them in the schools infinitely easier, because the relationship is essentially one of a prison warden to prisoners. And again, that paradigm of civilization and savagery. How do the kids get to school? Lots of different ways. Some of them are coerced, even kidnapped. Agents use very unscrupulous policies like withholding rations, throwing parents in jail, doing things like that until they relent and send some kids to fill a quota. On the other hand, some of them come voluntarily, and you may wonder why, and there are a lot of different reasons. One is there are very limited choices for Native people at that time. They are essentially confined to reservations. There's no social mobility. It's economically very desperate. Going to school is one way to potentially improve the future. And that's something the schools couldn't take away, was the tribal mentality. The tribal mentality is you don't think about yourself only, you think about the good of the group. So going and getting this education might be a way to find improvement for the future. It might be as simple as just a sense of adventure. The recruiters for the schools, and they did recruit, made their case for this, through very rose-colored glasses. They said, "Oh, it's going to be great. There's lots of room and fresh air, and you'll have apples and candy, and kumbaya," right? But of course, that was not the case. And I think if parents had known, they probably would have been even more reluctant to let their children go. But over time, these schools and the experience of re-education becomes part and parcel of what it is to be an American Indian. Multiple generations attend, thousands and thousands of students. School loyalties emerge, with multiple generations attending a place like Haskell. Pratt loved to wow audiences, white audiences, primarily with what he could do in this civilization process. He went out not just to recruit on the reservations, but to recruit people to his ideology so that he could get funding for the schools. And he would be kind of a master of PR, is what we call him today. So he liked to use these photos of students, what they looked like when they came to school, and then here's what I can do with them. You can see the outward appearance looks very different. Now, if we could get inside those minds, might be a different story. But you can see that clothing has been changed, hairstyles, and other outward identifications with native ways of appearance. You might ask how he gets their skin whiter. And I would say he probably, was not above using some trickery, kind of manipulation of those photo negatives. The assault on identity is again focused on the young, sometimes the very, very young. So you see students here at Haskell who would probably think of as, kindergarten age, maybe even younger. So the transformation, the assault, not just on the outward appearance, but on those internal things like language, religion, family ties, starts with the very young. And that's how Pratt and others saw it. We got to forget about the older generation. They're never going to change their ways. We have to get them when they're young. Again, the military kind of environment, highly structured. And this is a picture at Haskell in the 1890s, I think. And you can see the boys are in essentially, United States military kind of uniforms. Parents would occasionally come and visit to check on children. Those were always sanctioned visits, but at least officially. But what would that be like for an Indian parent to see their children dressed in the uniforms of what, for a number of them, had just until quite recently been the enemy, and in some cases was still considered that way. Life at boarding schools is very harsh. You not only get your haircut and your traditional clothing and protective kinds of, amulets and things taken away. Your names are changed very arbitrarily in cases, with administrators just picking something out of a book at random. But it was also very hard life because the schools were ridden with disease, and that caused deaths. And so, most colleges and universities, there might be some exceptions, but most colleges and universities, like Haskell, do not have graveyards on their campus. Indian schools pretty much always had graveyards on their campus. This is the Haskell Cemetery, and it reflects the 109 recorded deaths. There are people who are actually buried there on campus. There are probably a lot more who were sent home to die, who are not recorded there. So when those young people went to school, and maybe what motivated them was a tribal way of thinking, to go there and endure what was going to happen. They were making a sacrifice. And these young people who are buried there, they make the ultimate sacrifice because they never get to go home. I just have a few slides I'll go through quickly. I know my time is growing short, but the day at the boarding schools is divided in half. Half the day is in the classroom. And there you see just a sample classroom from Haskell, and it's divided by gender. The education in the early days is very rudimentary. It's what people of the old school call the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe a little bit of geography. And then, of course, the really important stuff like the names of the presidents and state capitals and national holidays, things like that. You detect a note of sarcasm, I hope. And there's another classroom. You can see, the age of the children varies. It's a real haphazard system at first. You might have a 5-year-old sitting next to a 15-year-old sitting next to a 20-year-old in the same classroom, kind of grouped by their exposure to Western culture. And then the other half of the day, they're working. And the idea is to give them a trade, a vocation. The biggest group of workers would be on the farm. Most Americans were farmers at that time in the late 19th century. That makes a certain amount of sense, but there's an underlying motive as well. And that is the federal government is spending virtually nothing. Once they've put the buildings in place, and like at Haskell, citizens donated the land, so the government didn't have to pay for that. Dudley Haskell enlisted his brother's architectural firm. I think you have some John G. Haskell buildings here in Topeka. Again, ever the politician, guiding those contracts. So that got them a discount, and then they spend about $1.75 per student per year. That's the magic number. So the rest of it has to come from somewhere. The institutions then become geared towards self-sustenance. And I put just as an example, the laundry in the boiler house. It's so grim looking, like something out of a Dickens novel. But the students are running the institution, children. They're whitewashing walls, they're growing the crops that are going to be fed to them in the cafeterias where the food is being served by students and the dishes cleaned by them, etc. So this idea of giving a lifelong skill, in a lot of cases, has a pretty limited conception of that. There's the wagons or the paint shop on the right, and you see they're painting Haskell wagons to be used on the campus. There are other areas, blacksmithing and carpentry and so forth, where maybe the promise of an industrial education goes a little bit further. Of course, along with the whole thinking of Western norms comes gender division of labor. So the boys have a tailor shop and the girls have a sewing room, because boys are going to go out into the world, young men, and make a living, and young ladies are going to be at home tending to the domestic sphere. And that, again, is a real slap in the face to the way that many Native people thought about gender, which was often quite different. They had much more of a focus on either balance between genders in terms of equity, or they were very shaped by identification with the mother's side of the family. So, but that wouldn't have even crossed the minds, really, of the administrators and the so-called Friends of the Indians. They wouldn't have even taken that into account. It just was, what they knew and thought was right. Something else they used began at Carlisle, Haskell, and the others adopted it pretty quickly, was what they called an outing system, where they would farm out essentially the labor of the students to local white communities. So the boys would work, on farms and ranches. Girls would be domestic servants. Again, kind of hewing to those gender norms. And, it's couched as training for citizenship. But, if you looked at it another way, I think we could aptly criticize it as a means of procuring cheap labor. I told you their days are really structured. Here's a sample boarding school day. It's pretty much calculated down to the minute. And again, that kind of military precision. And you can even see, they go to bed, lights out, listening to taps, and a lot of times they're waking up in the morning to reveille. So it's almost like they're in the military. Whatever you want to say, it's what the sociologist Irving Goffman would call a total institution. You're being totally controlled, as if you were in an asylum or a prison or something like that, which is really odd too. There's lots of ironies about boarding schools, but one of them would be the focus is on individualism, not tribalism, but they're really doing a lot of things that subsume individuality. That would be one of them. Students who don't conform are subjected to a lot of abuse. Here's the Haskell jail. At that point, it's overgrown and fallen into disuse. But students who didn't play ball are going to be thrown in jail and given a diet of bread and water until they relent. And then you see the child-sized handcuffs that were used to, the bounty hunters who would go out and bring back those who, rejected the school and tried to run away from it. That, incidentally, is not a product entirely of boarding schools. You have the whole institution of slavery, child-sized handcuffs are just being modified to use in a different way. And on the issue of abuse, the places are rife with all kinds of abuse. The obvious, which is the assault on identity, the language, spirituality, foodways, all kinds of things like that. But they also are places that use a lot of really harsh physical discipline. And they become, as other institutions have as well, places for predators. So sexual abuse occurs pretty regularly. What are they doing that might divert them from this very rigid kind of schedule? There are some diversions. Sports become one of them. Pratt didn't want the Indian boys to play football. They asked him if they could. And at first he said no, but then he thought, oh, well, good PR guy that I am, I could use that as a way to demonstrate, how I can transform these kids. And Haskell had football, was a big powerhouse in football in the 1920s, but being that it's Kansas, I'm going to put basketball first. So this is the Haskell team. Again, it's modeled on white standards of athletics, but natives add a lot of innovations. You could, if you looked into it, you could see that James Naismith, who is the creator of basketball as we know it, he made a lot of visits down to Haskell and saw the way they were playing the game and integrated a lot of their innovations into new strategies, let's say. Sports also becomes a way to honor that warrior tradition. And sports in the early days are for young men. The girls don't have that outlet. And so it's a way to replay old rivalries. The name of the book's escaping me, but there's a great book on the game that was played between Carlisle and Army, with Jim Thorpe on the Carlisle team and Dwight D. Eisenhower on the Army team. Back when they were young. So it's pretty symbolic, Indians versus Army. Right? Haskell will be playing KU, Bucknell, Notre Dame, Harvard, beating them regularly. And it's not even really a high school when they're doing that, playing against colleges. Another big tradition at Haskell was the annual performance of the play Hiawatha, which is based on Longfellow's poem. And it's really another one of these great ironies because Indians playing Indians according to how non-Indians conceive of them. But it was a safe way to be an Indian, I think you could say. This is a picture from one of the floats in downtown Lawrence at the Haskell Stadium dedication events. And, again, this symbolism, Indians of the past versus, how they're going to be in the future. Quickly, because I am running out of time and I want to leave some moments for questions. How do students respond to the school? Well, they resist in some ways, either covertly by getting away from the prying eyes of administration, sneaking off, speaking to each other in their native tongues, or cooking their own foods, or practicing ceremonies. There's overt resistance in form of just trying to break the routines, work slowdowns, fighting, damaging schools. They set fire to some of the schools and leaving. There are adjustments. How do you navigate the system and do that in myriad ways? There is a selective choosing, I think. So if you went back to those pictures of transformation, outwardly, it looks like they've changed, but how much takes place inside? I want to really impress upon you that these students are not just victims of a system, they are historical agents. And that's all the way up from perhaps motivations of going to school, to what they go through while they are there, and also trying to transform the schools. High school students are really at the forefront of bringing in new kinds of courses that are much better geared towards the needs of Indian country. And those would be like clerical skills and nursing and things like that. So the schools do change. Haskell is, I think, a great example because it starts off as a boarding school and now it's a modern center of higher education with a commitment to revitalization and celebration of American Indian cultures. So the schools also, in another irony, produce generations of people who are critical of what the schools did and move to change them. There are a lot of legacies of the schools, a lot of confused kids. I don't fit in either world, kind of thing. Intergenerational trauma, as you can imagine, it has an impact on language, religion, diet, family ties. Some did gain useful skills and some remembered the time they spent there fondly. Memory can be selective too, I suppose. But people, they made friends. Some of them became sweethearts and married, and that's why we have all these Haskell rascals running around. Developing healing strategies to contend with those things. And, there have been movements in the broader society to kind of walk back the damage, at least in the form of apologies, which is an important step. And I mentioned, Haskell's evolution. So I'll just leave you with this. The boarding schools, they did a lot of damage. They had a heavy impact, but they failed ultimately. Native people are still here. And so contrast of an early graduating class with a more recent one, okay? I probably went on longer than I intended to, but there is time for questions, so please.
So, listening to you carefully, people who were Native American that were required, and there was an expectation they had to go a way out.
There was an expectation. I mean, the system is pretty hastily conceived, let's say. So there wasn't a lot of systematic kinds of mechanisms to get them to school, and that's why there are different reasons for how they get there. It becomes pretty compulsory in terms of laws by the early 20th century, though, yes.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
By the 1870s, Native Americans, in essence, don't have a whole heck of a lot of power.
That's right.
Correct?
Yep.
So why did the American political system feel such a need to completely crush what was left?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
No, I think it's
a.
I think it's a great question. It sounds like a wonderful dissertation topic. I don't know. Guilt. The context of always seeing natives as a problem to be overcome. And so this was kind of, I mean, to borrow a very cruel but parallel phrase, something of a final solution. So I think a lot of it's driven by very old colonial thinking. And the idea too that at some point, and this is an ongoing thing, it happens with termination policy. It's happening in debates about Indian country today. The government wants to get out of the Indian business. They don't want to have to pay in perpetuity to keep them on reservations, to fund them, because when they're on reservations, they're on the dole, essentially. Food, tools, machinery, buildings, that's all being paid for by the government. So, I mean, I think there's been also that long tradition of kind of like, okay, how do we finally get done with this? And assimilation, I think, is one ultimate answer.
I have a follow-up. Is it possible this coming into play in the 1870s, a reaction to the loss of the South in the Civil War?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in a couple of different ways. I mean, the loss of so many Americans in the Civil War, period. I mean, we're tired of killing people, and you're never going to be able to kill everybody, That's the reality of it. But also, yeah, I think there's a lot of modeling of assimilation for Indians that also mirrors what the government was trying to do, either directly or indirectly, with the promise of integration for African Americans. Emphasize the word promise. But the whole armies of school teachers who are being sent into the South during Reconstruction. Pratt's idea for Carlisle came pretty directly from the Hampton Institute in Virginia, which was set up by another military guy to train newly freed African American slaves. So I think there are parallels there. Yeah.